Hello, and welcome to Based on a True Story, the podcast that compares your favorite Hollywood movies with history. Today, we're going to learn about the 1993 film Schindler's List. Now, Schindler's List was directed by Steven Spielberg with a screenplay written by Steven Zalian based on the novel by Thomas Keneally called Schindler's Ark. The story in Schindler's List, though, follows Liam Neeson's version of Oskar Schindler as he arrives in Nazi-occupied Krakow, Poland, with the hopes of making a lot of money. To this end goal, he takes advantage of the Nazi agenda against the Jews to employ Jews at his factory because the Nazis make it easier to use a Jewish workforce as basically slave labor during World War II. As the war continues, Schindler realizes what the Nazis are doing and turns into a rescuer as he tries to get as many Jews as he can into his factory and away from the Nazis' genocidal plans. Speaking of which, I think right now is a great time to issue a disclaimer. Since Schindler's List is about the Holocaust, as you can imagine, we're going to be covering some of those atrocities. So, you know how some TV shows start with viewer discretion advised? Well, this is that. Viewer discretion is advised, or listener discretion if you're hearing the audio-only version. So we're going to be talking about the atrocities and not showing them on screen, of course. With that said, helping us separate fact from fiction in Schindler's List today is Dan McMillan. Dan is the executive director of Save Democracy in America, and he's also the author of How Could This Happen? Explaining the Holocaust. So he's the perfect person to help us understand exactly that. How could the atrocities that we see happening in the movie actually happen in real life? Before we connect with Dan, though, it's time to set up our game today. 2 truths and a lie. If you're new to the show, here's how it works. I'll give you 3 things. 2 of them are true, and that means one of them is just going to be an all-out lie. Are you ready? Okay, here they are. Number 1. The Nazis had a plan to murder all the Jews even before World War II started. Number 2, citizens of Krakow knew there was a Nazi concentration camp nearby. Number 3, unlike what we see in the movie, Schindler came to Krakow wanting to help Jews. Got him? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, your challenge is to identify which one of those is the lie. And of course, we'll do a recap at the end of the episode to see how well you did. All right, now it's time to connect with Dan McMillan about the historical accuracy of Schindler's List. Before we dive into some of the details of the movie, let's take a step back and look at Schindler's List from an overall perspective. What letter grade would you give it for historical accuracy?
I would say an A and about as many pluses as you're allowed to ask, despite the fact that in many, but I need to qualify that in the sense that in so many respects, it actually deviates from what we know about the real Oskar Schindler. So you could say that it's full of factual inaccuracies and errors, but on the other hand, it does what historical fiction does best, and which really surpasses what academic historians like myself are capable of doing, because it makes vivid, it makes real, and it provides a plausible reconstruction of things, of what we most want to know about history, which is what made these people tick. Why did they do the things they did? How did they rationalize their terrible actions to each other? How did they feel about what they were doing? How did they talk to each other? The thing is that when you're an historian like me, you are chained to the documentary record. And the documentary record, it doesn't give you the dialogue in meetings. The only time you get dialogues in meetings is if there were a stenographer present. And all these conversations that are so important. For example, almost every conversation among perpetrators of the Holocaust was not on paper. The orders to murder were transmitted verbally rather than in writing. I mean, there is a paper trail of many aspects of the Holocaust, but in some ways, the basic understanding that this is an order from Hitler comes from the highest authority, that the goal is to murder every person of Jewish ancestry in the continent of Europe. That is on paper only very rarely. And so the dialogue in the film, almost all the dialogue is pure fiction. And yet, on the other hand, if the director and the author of the screenplay do their research, do their homework in the documentary sources and in what historians have read, they can imagine dialogue that, yeah, it didn't take place that way, but it's completely plausible and it brings it to life. And, one of the things that's so disappointing to me, as you know, I wrote an article specifically about Schindler's List and about the ways that I see it, how impressive it is from my point as an historian. And I read a number of the things that historians had written about Schindler's List. And a lot of this stuff that is written by historians is really kind of petty. And all they want to do is find fault with this or that factual inaccuracy, overlooking the fact that this film makes the Holocaust real to people in a way that our work as historians never will, and also gets at, again, these truths at the mental world of the killers and the mental world of the victims and of the bystanders in a way that we just can't. And so to me, historical fiction is not just entertainment. It's a form of history. It's an adjunct. It supplements academic history. Now, a lot of historical fiction does this much better than other historical fiction. This is the gold standard for historical fiction. I mean, I have to tell you, the more I look, every time I look at it, the more I look at it, I find something new to admire and to be impressed by it. And I have to tell you, I watched it twice in recent weeks to prepare for our conversation. And my hat's off to Spielberg, to the screenwriter, to everyone in that project. It is a stunning achievement. Everyone should watch this film, and they should watch it many, many times.
You mentioned the order to murder mostly being done verbally, but we know from history that the Nazis documented a lot of things. Were they specifically not wanting to document those orders, or was it just something that was just almost an implied, everybody just kind of understands?
Well, everyone did come to understand, and there were a lot of sources. But as far as the people in the SS who directed and organized and carried out pretty much all the killing, we do understand that there were verbal orders transmitted down the chain of command from Himmler to his subordinates in the SS. Usually Himmler himself or one of his deputies, particularly Reinhard Heydrich, would actually go, for example, to Auschwitz and speak personally to Rudolf Höss, the commandant at Auschwitz, and brief him. There's no paper trail of the meetings at which would have been meetings really between Hitler, Himmler, and Heydrich, at which Hitler reached his decision that the plan now is not that we're going to kill, say, Jews in the Soviet Union. We are going to completely exterminate the so-called Jewish race on the continent of Europe. And in the back of everyone's mind, I think, was an understanding, if we become powerful enough to dominate the entire world, which I think is something Hitler wanted, then one of the highest order on their agenda would be just striking every single Jewish community around the globe, because they saw the Jews as a virus, effectively, and if you can, you want to stamp it out everywhere so it can never grow back. There's a lot of debate among historians as to when this decision was reached, going all the way from, say, early 1941. There are some historians and good historians who've argued that there was never even a point where it was decided and that it didn't really become policy until March of 1942. The best reconstruction, however, in my view, and I've really spent a lot of time parsing them, I think sort of the second or third week in October of 1941. That is to say, about 4 months after Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, they've already murdered at least 500,000 people through the shooting squads. Work has already begun in construction of a couple of death camps, but we just have little fragments of conversation that have survived, and also very crucial for the dating. It was October 23rd of 1941. Himmler issued an order banning all further Jewish immigration from any part of German-controlled Europe. Up till that point, the policy still had formally been, our goal is just to get get rid of the Jews in areas under our control and out of our society by abusing them so badly they'll flee. And but at that point, it's clear we don't want to let any escape our grasp because we want to kill them all.
If we head back to the movie, at the beginning, we are introduced to Oskar Schindler as a businessman. He is a member of the Nazi Party, and he moves to Krakow with one purpose: to make money. With the war, he takes advantage of the Nazi policy against Jews to use them as cheap labor. They say cheap labor. It's really slave labor because the movie points out that the Jewish workers don't get paid anything. The money that Schindler pays for being able to use Jewish workers goes to the Nazi government. How well does the movie do setting up Schindler's story and his reason for being in Krakow?
Well, actually, it seems to do a pretty bad job. I'm saying this comparing the story to what was, at least at that time, that the movie was made, the best reconstruction we had, which is the novel Schindler's List by Thomas Keneally, which is the main source that I read also when writing my article, which is about 10 years ago. And Keneally took his job very seriously, although he's not an academic historian, he's a novelist, but he interviewed something like 50 people, 50 eyewitnesses. And in the novel, I was very impressed by the way that he separated that which was definitely fact, that things that he fictionalized for whatever purpose, and things upon which he speculated and engaged in educated guesses without being able to document. So I take the Keneally's novel as probably the most solid reconstruction we've got. What's apparent from Keneally actually is that Schindler already wants to help Jews by the time he moves to Krakow. And he makes a point of employing them because he knows that he's going to treat them better than any other German employer. I mean, at that point in 1940, they've committed a lot of murders of Jews in Poland during the invasion of Poland, but it's maybe 20,000. They don't yet have a genocidal plan, much less a plan for murdering all Jews in Europe. So the fate of the Jews is unclear. On the other hand, their treatment of Jews has already been so bad. And so, the Schindler of reality was already really hostile to the Nazi regime. He came originally not from Germany, but from the western rim of Czechoslovakia, the so-called Sudetenland. If you remember the confrontation in October of 1938, and there was a conference at Munich where the British and the French basically sold Czechoslovakia down the river and said, no, you've got to give up the Sudetenland, which was settled overwhelmingly by German speakers. And they were brought part of Germany. And that was kind of the last dramatic act of appeasement that gave Hitler so much opportunity. Probably one of the last best opportunities to stop Hitler. Already at that point, Schindler is a native of the Sudetenland. He's not happy about what has happened. He becomes a Nazi Party member because it's convenient for his business purposes. It establishes his credentials, but he's already inwardly, to some degree, an opponent of the regime. On the other hand, the way that Schindler's motive, the Schindler of the movie, who says, okay, I'll take Jewish labor because it's cheaper for me. That, on the other hand, was utterly typical of the overwhelming majority of German corporations which used Jewish slave labor. And there was an enormous amount of it. The slave labor was usually in camps that were run by the SS where the conditions were absolutely savage, where the death rate was very high. A rough guess of how many Jewish slave laborers died in these camps serving German industry is about 500,000. And these German managers, corporations, personnel were fully aware of what was happening and had no problem with it. So in that sense, Schindler the movie is a typical German businessman, but he was an Oskar Schindler.
That was actually going to be one of my questions too about that is if that was then plausible, with Schindler's plan in the movie, using Jewish workers as slave labor to make money. It sounds like that was a thing that did happen, even if it wasn't Schindler himself.
That's right. In fact, that was the norm. And an enormous number of German businesses happily took advantage of this basically very cheap labor. They had to pay the SS a very low rate for the benefit of having the slave labor. They knew that the turnover in these camps was enormous. That is the attrition through malnutrition and just outright murder for sport. And they were happy with it. I mean, that's one of the things that's so impressive. They showed a lot of courage on Spielberg's part that he makes a film about Schindler because Schindler did become a rescuer. On the other hand, he presents Schindler in a way that is far more typical of most rescuers, because most rescuers weren't born rescuers. Very few people are born villains or born heroes. They evolve into one direction or another under the pressure of circumstances. They do have a measure of free will and they do make choices. But I think Schindler is more, not that rescuers is not a topic that I have focused on in my research, but everything that I have seen of them is that they were morally ambiguous people like Schindler, who did not act out. Schindler didn't become a rescuer out of high principle because he had no moral principles, at least the Schindler of the film, right? He cheats on his wife every chance he gets. He's corrupt and so on. In a lot of ways, he's not a very attractive, he's charming, but he's not a really attractive person, in moral terms. But he becomes a rescuer ultimately because he loves people. He delights in people. He just has an affection for other human beings. And it's this fellow feeling that under the pressure of circumstances makes him into a rescuer. And I think that's really kind of more characteristic of rescuers, of other rescuers in the Holocaust. That said, take that with a grain of salt. There are people who specialize in the study of rescuers. I'm not one of them.
In Krakow, the way the movie shows the Nazis rounding up the Jews for the Krakow ghetto, it shows it as not an immediate process. There are scenes of Jewish families wondering how long the schools will be closed. Then we find out they're not able to own businesses and they're given work details. Then, according to the movie, by March 20th, 1941, all Jews are ordered to relocate to a walled district that's only 16 blocks. That's the ghetto. We see scenes of families being taken from their homes and forced to live in a single room with a dozen other people that they don't know. Is that a good depiction of how the Nazis forced the Jews into the Krakow ghetto?
It is, although the reality, I think, in all these ghettos was far worse. One of the things I think also that is very smart that Spielberg does is there are moments where he shows you horror in in a way that's just a gut punch. The scene, for example, the one-armed man whom Itzhak Stern and Kingsley has rescued by bringing him to Schindler's factory. He brings the man up to thank Schindler for saving his life. And Schindler's furious at this, So what do you mean? And then a couple of minutes later, when the SS stopped this group of Jews, make them get out to shovel snow. How can a one-armed man shovel snow? And they execute him on the spot. They murder him on the spot. And you see him being shot in the head. There's blood in the snow. But these are brief moments. One of the things that Spielberg does is he doesn't numb you by rubbing your nose in horror every single minute of the film. Because if you do that for too long to an audience, they get turned off. They can't watch it. If they're at home, they change the channel. And so he hands you the horror in moments that are absolutely unvarnished in their brutality and very effective. But most of the time, you don't see it that harsh. With regard to the ghettos, the squalor, the unsanitary conditions, also there was insufficient food, insufficient coal for heating in the winters. You had deaths from exposure. In the early months of 1942, in the Warsaw ghetto, which at that point had a population of about 450,000, I think at least 5,000 were dying a month.
Wow.
It was quite a death rate from hunger, from exposure. Some of the population had been more well off before they were crowded into the ghetto, had things like jewelry, gold and silver, better clothes that they could smuggle out, trade with people outside the ghetto for extra food. and maybe some coal for heating who had better survival chances. People who had been poor by the time they went into the ghetto, then their chances of survival were terrible. And it's the same with the Plaszow slave labor camp. He shows some of the horror. He shows Amon Goeth, and this is very much something that Goeth actually did. Picking off workers with his deer rifle, his hunting rifle, and, SS guards murdering Jews for sport, for amusement casually. That happened all the time in these slave labor camps. On the other hand, the life in these camps, there was so much more horror that Spielberg could have shown, but again, he didn't. Just to not overwhelm us, to give us just enough horror that we could deal with it.
That's a great way of phrasing it. I didn't really think about that, because if you do show too much, then you are going to get numb to it. Were the soldiers that were there doing that, did you think they almost got numb to it as well? Because in the real story, they were the ones inflicting it.
That is a fascinating, question from the sources that I've read. And again, the sources are fragmentary. There's a range of responses. It seems like, and this is a percentage that you get from psychological experiments and from observations of people in these positions of power in other contexts as well. It seems like about a third became out and out sadists who took pleasure in what they were doing and often toyed with the prisoners. Maybe they didn't shoot them, but kneel, I'm going to shoot you, but then not shoot you, do this or that. It seems like the majority tried to just see it as a job, rationalize it away as, well, I'm following orders, not necessarily be enthusiastic, often deal with the ugliness of what they were doing, the trauma of what they're doing by abusing alcohol in their time off. There'd be a much smaller group who might display very small, minimal, ultimately insignificant acts of kindness, who were clearly troubled morally by what they were doing and tried to retain some measure of their humanity. This sort of, kind of 30% sadists, 60% kind of neutral, and 10% somewhat more humane. You see that, for example, in the Stanford prison experiment, I think in Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments. Also, what we've seen in, there was a very good study of a shooting squad of 500 men, Reserve Police Battalion 101, one of the best books I know, very readable for the general public, called Ordinary Men, Reserve Police Battalion 101, and the Final Solution in Poland by Christopher Browning, who is, I think, the finest living Holocaust historian. And that also you see kind of a similar division. And Rudolf Höss, the commandant of the Auschwitz death camp, made a similar division among his guards.
You mentioned earlier that the camp and Amon Goeth, and in the movie, we see it's almost the impression that I get, from the Jews in the Krakow ghetto is they think, oh, well, things can't get any worse. And then they do, because we see Amon Goeth get introduced. He organizes the liquidation of the Krakow ghetto. All the Jews are forced to move to the newly built forced labor camp in Plaszow. And then Goeth is overseeing that camp. And inside the camp, the conditions are even more brutal than in the ghetto. Murder is an everyday thing. And it sounds like, from what you're saying there, the movie does a pretty good job of showing the way things were in Plaszow camp.
It shows a good range of the brutal things that can happen, but it doesn't rub your nose that deeply in the horror. But then there are these moments, for example, and this is one of the most brutal scenes, and really essential that he does this, is the selection that's conducted. If you remember, it's Goeth is on his balcony getting his semi-annual physical, and below him in the camp, you have a group of SS doctors set up at these tables, and all the prisoners are running around in front of the doctors, and they're trying to look healthy because they know that the ones who are deemed to be insufficiently healthy are going to be sent to Auschwitz and murdered. They may not exactly know what Auschwitz is, but they know that if they're transported away, their lives are over. And if you remember also in the barracks, the women puncture their fingertips with needles and smear blood in their cheeks as rouge to look more healthy, more robust. And that selection process is something that's done all the time, calling those who are less capable of labor or incapable of labor. And in the same scene, that's when they cart away almost all the children. And a few of the children, it's a minority of the children, but a few of the children understand, I don't want to be in that truck that's taking me away. And they run for hiding places. And one of them ends up jumping into the sewage pit of a latrine, which is something that did in fact happen, that Jews trying to escape being murdered sometimes did hide in sewage pits in this way. And that has been documented. Whether they happen at Plaszow or not, I don't know. And that's an example where in a very brief moment, it's 30 seconds, nonetheless, he really hammers home just the complete degree to which the killers dehumanized their victims, how hard it was to survive, the lengths you had to go to survive, the depth of the horror. But again, he gives you 30 seconds instead of rubbing your nose in it for 15 minutes when you can't handle that.
Looking back at it from a historical lens, the idea of the Nazis going from restrictions on the Jews to then putting them all in the Krakow ghetto and then sending them to the forced labor camp. It wasn't like they just sent everybody to the forced labor camp at once. Do we know why they imposed these restrictions gradually?
Well, the German policy toward the Jews evolved in a series of steps, and a lot of it was improvised because it wasn't, for example, at the time that World War II began on the 1st of September 1939, even Hitler had no idea that he was going to order the murder of all the Jews of Europe. At that point, they were still thinking in terms of expulsion. Then they conquer all of Western Europe. Suddenly, they've got control of a larger Jewish population. They know that other countries are not going to accept this many Jewish refugees. They begin to think in terms of solutions that clearly have a genocidal aspect. One thought they have is they're going to round up all the Jews that are within their area of influence in Europe, some 6.5 million, and ship them to the island of Madagascar in the Indian Ocean, which is cannot support a population of that size. That idea is then abandoned because they don't achieve air superiority over the British Isles in the Battle of Britain. So they decide not to invade Britain. Since the British control the sea lanes, the Madagascar plan is out. Hitler pivots to the plan to invade the Soviet Union. At that point, in early 1940, there's an idea they're going to expel all the Jews of Europe to beyond the Ural Mountains, to every part of the Soviet Union that they don't actually annex and make part of Germany, with the expectation that the majority are going to die out, of starvation, exposure, and so on. And so they evolved to genocide in increments. You already see at the beginning, after they've conquered Poland, they're forcing Jews to move from the countryside and they concentrate them in cities. They take their names and so on. Then they move them into ghettos. And a lot of that is preparation for the idea that we're going to deport them to some kind of, again, reservation, some sort of part that's away from us, where they can't contaminate or damage our society, and where a lot of them are going to die. As far as when the ghettos are actually liquidated and forced into, and their inhabitants, some of the ghettos are liquidated, and those who can work are put into labor camps like Plaszow, and the rest. They show the scene where they go through the ghetto and they're just savagely brutal. They're shooting people right and left, and that's completely accurate. That is a terrific depiction of how that process happened. It's interesting, they don't really make a point of showing that those among those tens of thousands who are not seen as likely candidates for slave labor, those people would all have been shipped off to Auschwitz. but they don't really show that. And a lot of the ghettos were liquidated where everyone is sent immediately to a death camp. The liquidation of the Krakow ghetto was in March of 1943, I think it was. It was in 43 that they show it. And that just kind of depended on local circumstances.
That is something that I guess is something good to keep in mind when talking about or watching Schindler's List, that it is focusing on the one camp, but like you're mentioning, they don't show people being shipped off to Auschwitz as much because following the storyline almost, of certain people and where they go from the ghetto to this one particular camp. But it is a much bigger picture. There are a lot other camps there. There's a much bigger picture.
And the other thing that's good about focusing on it, because they're also showing just what the Jews of Krakow were able to know. Because the Jews of Krakow didn't have the full picture in Europe. And that in a way is also a sign of good historical thinking. Because one of the things that you can make is mistakes that a lot of people, including historians, can make in looking at the past as we project our own knowledge back into the past. It's really important to always step into the shoes of the people you're studying and ask yourself, what information did they have? How did this look to them?
If we shift back to Schindler, there is a transition moment in the film for Oskar Schindler. He's going horseback riding one morning, and it happens to be the same day as the liquidation of the Krakow ghetto. And he watches as people are murdered in the streets. And we kind of see this transition almost happening, nothing in dialogue necessarily, but that's kind of when the transition seems to happen in the movie. Is it fair to say that that is around the time when Schindler started to evolve beyond the mindset of just making money?
It's interesting. I mean, I think that's clearly a turning point. He's very troubled. His mistress is distraught. The first actual rescue in the film, is at least a good 20 minutes later. If you remember in Plaszow, the refined character goes into the workshop. There's a man making hinges. He accuses the man of not working fast enough, takes him outside, tries to murder him, and two of his pistols malfunction. And Ben Kingsley tells Schindler about this, and so Schindler at that point gives Kingsley, I think, a wristwatch or a lighter. It's like a silver-plated cigarette lighter, which is used as a necessary bribe. It's actually, I think, to the Jewish police in the Plaszow camp to get this man transferred to the safety of Schindler's factory. To me, that's the first rescue.
You mentioned the Jewish police there, and that was something I wanted to ask about too, because we do see there's a police force of Jews that are paid to help the Nazis and all of this. I'm assuming, was that really a thing?
No, absolutely. In the ghettos, it's interesting. One thing that puzzled me, and I can't say whether I know that this is true or not, whether they still retained the Jewish police in the camps, as opposed to just letting the SS guards do all of those functions. There, I'm actually a little skeptical. But in the ghettos, basically the Germans would have a Jewish community of elders. The Jewish council would essentially oversee the government of the ghettos, like the Krakow ghetto, the ghetto in Łódź, and every other ghetto for as long as the ghettos existed. And they had a Jewish police that managed, so that the Germans did very little administrative work in the ghettos, and which then put these elders and Jewish police in a terrible position where they might perceive themselves or be perceived by the people around them as collaborators. On the other hand, they are also in a position perhaps to do favors, to try in some way to mitigate the harm done by the Germans. And it's not unreasonable for them to see themselves that way, because had all the Jews in a ghetto refused to cooperate with the Germans by setting up this Jewish government function, the Germans would have just gone in and killed everyone right on the spot, or they would have sent everyone to a death camp right on the spot. So it was actually a rational thing to do. And not to say, however, that members of the Jewish police in many ghettos and Jewish self-government, Jewish councils in ghettos were perceived as traitors, and some of them In one account I read, were in fact murdered, by some of the other members, inhabitants of those ghettos, because they were perceived as traitors. On the other hand, I personally cannot find it in my heart to judge them. They're put in an absolutely impossible situation that they did not create.
In the Krakow ghetto, while that scene is going on, I wanted to ask, because the movie is almost entirely black and white, but there is an exception that Spielberg makes in the Krakow ghetto, and it's a little girl in a red coat. Schindler's watching her as she wanders the street. People are being murdered around her. Eventually, she makes her way into a house and hides under a bed. Do we know if she was based on a real person?
I'm almost morally certain that she's a fiction, that she's a metaphor of some kind. I don't know what the metaphor is exactly. I mean, the decision to film in black and white altogether is an very interesting decision. I am inclined myself to see this again as another way, part of the strategy that I talked about earlier, of not rubbing our nose too often in the horror, so that we have enough distance that we can appreciate the horror, to give us the horror in dose that we can manage, so that we are suitably horrified. And I kind of feel like the black and white, that establishes distance for us. You show it, you show the blood in color when someone's shot in the head. It's a little different from black and white. And I kind of see the girl in the red coat as a subtle way of Spielberg of reminding us, kind of flicking us back into the present. This is not some black and white distant fiction. This really happened. And then you see her at one point later when they burn all the bodies that they dig up, and you see that she did not survive. And her body is carried on a conveyor belt. Her face is rotted away. But you see the red coat, the color.
That's a great point. It helps bring you back to this was reality.
And also to remind you that the Jews are not an undifferentiated mass of victims. They are individuals with agency. What you also see, I guess, about her is she's a plucky little girl separated from her parents who goes and seeks safety on her own by hiding under a bed. And the courage of the victims is also something that I think has become more and more appreciated in recent research, I would say, but is something that we don't always internalize, shall I say. I don't mean this as a criticism of anyone, because in fact, they were fundamentally powerless to change their fate in 99.9% of the cases. That does not mean, however, that they became completely passive, that they were robbed of agency, that they did not show courage, or that they did not resist, because they did in all kinds of ways.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned earlier the man with the hinges, and if we go back to the movie, there is another time where we see Schindler saving somebody that I wanted to ask you about. There's this Jewish woman named Regina Perlman who comes to beseech Schindler on behalf of her parents. And at first he's kind of taken aback because she comes in and she mentions something, that everyone says that your factory is a haven. And that seems to be the first time he's heard of this. And I don't know how much he actually believed it in the movie, but he says something along the lines of, she's trying to entrap him to doing something illegal. But then later he does use his wristwatch to bribe the guards or the Jewish police, I don't remember which one it was, to bring her parents to the factory. How much of that really happened?
I doubt that I don't remember that from the Keneally novel. It's entirely plausible. I think that if someone came to a man in Schindler's position and said, we hear that your factory's a haven, that no one dies there, that he might well see this as a provocateur working for the Gestapo, and would then make a point of shouting at her. And he does also appear to be, well, in fact, is upset by this, because then 2 minutes later, he's berating Ben Kingsley, who has been saving people, has himself been bringing to Schindler's factory people who would likely be murdered at Plaszow because, like, the man who's with only one arm and so on. And they had this whole conversation about Amon Goeth, about, I think it's at that scene, in peacetime, he wouldn't be such a bad fellow, but war brings out the bad in people. And then, Kingsley tells him the story about Goeth, where a prisoner has escaped from a work detail of 50 men, and Goeth shoots half of them, 25, just walking around with his pistol, getting blood all over his own face. And, Kingsley says, yeah, he really likes killing. And there's a shift. And that's when he gives the watch to Ben Kingsley, to Itzhak Stern, to rescue the Perlmans. That's interesting. It's kind of right after that point that he comes to see him, embraces the idea that he's a rescuer and is proud of it, because right after that, he's at the party, I think it's for Goeth's birthday, at the villa, and he has a conversation in the wine cellar with Helena Hirsch, and that's the personal servant, the maid for Amon Goeth, for whom Goeth develops these romantic feelings. And, she's very frightened, and Schindler says, you know who I am, I'm Schindler. And because he realizes, because he was told only 3 or 4 minutes earlier in the film by Regina Perelman, they say you are good. And he says that he likes that. He likes the idea that he's good. And then he says all these things to comfort her. And he gives her a bar of chocolate, so she can build up her strength, or she can trade it for something. And, she's terrified. She talks about how there's no rhyme or reason to who he murders. He just shot someone. She happened to be walking by. She's going to shoot me. And, Schindler says, no, he won't shoot you. He enjoys you. That's another one. But the thing that's so fascinating about the film, how hard it is to pinpoint when he becomes a rescuer. But I guess for me, that's the moment when not only has he become a rescuer, when he takes pride in being a rescuer.
Yeah, and which kind of leads, at least according to the Schindler in the movie, leads him to being okay with stepping outside the bounds of the law or the rules in place, or the accepted norms of the Nazi Party, yes, to do what's right
yes,
morally. Yeah, you mentioned Helen Hirsch, and I wanted to ask about her because we do see Amon Goeth kind of having this, starting to have feelings for her. We don't see the extent of them necessarily, but we know that she's a Jewish woman that he's forcing to work in his house. And he has this one line where he says that she's not a person in the strictest sense of the word. And that really stood out to me. Was that something that Nazis really believed about Jews or women or both?
Not about women. It's actually been argued that in some ways the Nazi racial project empowered and upvalued German women, since they were the breeders of the next generation of genetically superior Germans. They had a special role that had gone unappreciated before the Nazis came to power. And in other ways, and women were very active in organizations of the Nazi Party. There were also female concentration camp guards where there were female prisoners, some of whom got executed for their crimes after the war. But as far as seeing Jews, no, not as a person, not as human. You're not a person in the strictest sense of the word. To me, that's kind of the single most powerful scene in the entire movie. Because, he's lonely. And he says, I would so much like to reach out to you and touch you in your loneliness. But she's not the one who's lonely. She's connected with other human beings. He, on the other hand, he has cut himself off from humanity because he's made himself a monster. He's made himself inhuman by denying her humanity, by denying the humanity of this huge branch of the human family. And it's so impressive. She stands there. She trembles a bit. Clearly, she's frightened, and with good reason, since he murders people. It's also, I think, that she's so disgusted with him because she's in the presence of a monster, of something inhuman. And he tries to connect with her, and he has this conversation with her that's a monologue that he wants to be a conversation. At one point, like he's talking to her, he says, I know this is awkward because, strictly speaking, you're not a person, or you're not a person in the strict sense of the word. And then he says, well, you've got a good point there. Imagining, I guess, that she said, well, that's how you treat me, you know? And then he says, but maybe the problem isn't us, you and me. Maybe the problem is this, meaning like the war or Nazism or my job. That cuts no ice with her. And it's, you know, if all she cared about were her survival, she would have, you know, played nice with him, you know, or even agreed to become his mistress. And instead, she rejects him. She refuses to acknowledge his humanity, just as he refuses to acknowledge, he's trying to acknowledge hers because, in fact, she is a human being, you know, and you see him balancing on it. He looks at her and he says, you know, they call you rats and vermin, which in fact is how he calls them and sees them. But are these the eyes of a rat? And then there's a line, I think it's actually from The Merchant of Venice by Shakespeare, hath not a Jew eyes, you know? But he can't go that far. And he moves in to kiss her. And then he says, I don't think so. You Jewish bitch. You almost talked me into it. She didn't say a word. You almost talked me into it. And then he erupts in rage, but also in pain. I mean, he's screaming like a wounded beast, and he hits her, and he pulls down the case of wine bottles on top of her. I mean, the man's a sadist. You know, he enjoys toying with people. He enjoys shooting people at random. But in this case, he's like a wounded beast. And in a way, I don't know, you can say that it's karmically good. I mean, he has gotten his reward for denying the humanity of other human beings. If you deny the humanity of others, you deny your own humanity. That's what he's done. And she knows it. And on some level, he knows she knows. And the courage that she displays in the scene, I mean, a Jewish woman in that scene has so little agency, is so powerless. The Germans have the ability, as Goethe says in another scene, to kill arbitrarily. That's why they fear us. We can kill at a whim. We kill whenever we feel like it. Nonetheless, she does precisely that which is going to enrage him most. And that is superhuman courage. Every time I see that, I just have such admiration for that character. And that's another reason why that scene is just so moving to me.
She doesn't say anything, but she still manages to show us who the real person is.
Exactly. Who's the human in this conversation? Who has dignity? And I mean, she won't even meet his eyes. Won't even make eye contact with him. Just stares ahead in space. It's very impressive.
You mentioned this briefly earlier with the party, and there is a sequence. It's after the party, but we see Schindler getting arrested and put in jail for violating what they call the Race and Resettlement Act.
Yeah,
and it has nothing to do with the Perlmans or any of the other Jews that up to this point in the movie Schindler has helped, but because at that party Schindler kissed a Jewish girl, but then according to the movie, at least he's not in jail for long. Goethe is somebody who kind of helps, and some other Nazis help speak on Schindler's behalf to get him out of jail. Can you explain a little bit more what the Race and Resettlement Act was, and did Schindler get arrested for violating it like we see in the movie?
Well, it was one of a countless number of laws that basically affirmed the belief that Jews were not human, were something less, not only not human, but really a kind of vermin in human form, again, a virus that we want to stamp out. Well, first of all, I'm highly skeptical that Schindler would have been so stupid as to kiss that woman and surrounded by SS men. Secondly, I doubt very much that he would have been in danger of criminal punishment or that he would have been locked up. But it's a way of just making a point. It's a good short way of conveying the extent to which the regime, and in particular the members of the SS, who prided themselves on their commitment to Nazi racial ideology that they took this belief that they would lock you up for kissing a Jewish girl. In fact, there were SS men who had Jewish mistresses and who were not punished for it. I mean, I've read sources, I won't swear to their veracity in a higher case, because some accounts you get of what went on in death camps. There's so few surviving witnesses. You need to be careful, but I did read one reference to Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, having a Jewish woman that he kept locked up in a cell that he would visit periodically to take his pleasure. I read another account of a guard at Treblinka who supposedly, quote unquote, fell in love with a Jewish girl in the camp and that they carried on an affair. He wasn't punished, but his colleagues, the other guards, sent him on leave for 3 days. And while he was gone, they shot her. I mean, it would have been plausible if they'd shown in the film the girl that he'd kissed getting executed by Amon Goeth or something. That's plausible. But the point is, this is another example of, okay, so maybe that particular event didn't happen. I'm pretty sure that it did not. On the other hand, it's a great way of briefly conveying one of the essential truths that we really need to know about the Holocaust.
Well, in the movie's timeline, we're up to April of 1944 now, and there's a new horrific thing that the Nazis are doing. They're forcing the Jews to exhume and burn the bodies of over 10,000 Jews who were killed at Plaszow and during the Krakow ghetto massacre that we saw happen earlier. And Goeth said something to Schindler, like, as if I don't have enough to do. They come up with this. Why would the Nazis go through the effort of doing something like that?
They were losing the war and they wanted to conceal the evidence of their crimes. For example, 3 of the death camps, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, were blown up, dynamited, bulldozered over. I think already by the end of 1943, they dynamited the gas chambers at Auschwitz, all but one of them, in 1944 as the Red Army was closing in. So they did have special details of SS that went around exhuming the bodies of mass shootings, the victims of mass shootings, and people who were killed in death camps, and burning them. And that would have been the purpose. There are 2 things about that scene that I want to highlight that I think are really interesting. One is how Goeth refers to them, because he doesn't refer to them as bodies. He calls them rags. And in fact, testimony, this is eyewitness testimony from the Claude Lanzmann's film Shoah, which is this documentary that consists almost entirely of eyewitness testimony. When they did this in Latvia, near Vilnius, where they dug up the bodies of so many Jewish victims who'd been shot into mass graves, the Germans specifically forbade the Jewish prisoners the surviving Jewish prisoners who were digging up and helping burn the bodies from referring to them as bodies or corpses. They were directed to refer to them as rags, blocks of wood, or shit. And this is just another way. And the other thing that was kind of interesting, there's a brief moment, and it's not commented on, but they've got a conveyor belt that is just taking these remains and dumping them on top of a giant heap where a fire is burning. And this SS man stands in front of it, and he's just kind of screaming and howling, but not in distress. It's kind of more in excitement and with abandon. And then he turns and points his pistol at the burning heap of corpses and fires a few shots at it with no purpose. And it's kind of, I'm stretching here, I'm speculating. There's a wide range, that you need to have between what you know with certainty and what is just an educated guess. But one of the things that is not commented on nearly enough about the Holocaust, I think, is the pleasure. There's a pleasure in transgression, large and small. There's a pleasure that a child might take in shoplifting on a dare. And there was pleasure for the killers in the transgression involved in mass murder, because it's liberating and it can make you feel, it can give you this it seems to have given some of them a kind of godlike feeling that I am subject to no moral constraints. I dispose of life and death. I am the arbiter. I am the master of life and death. Sometimes they call themselves masters of death. Here is this scene that's like right out of the Inferno. It's from the pit of hell. And this SS man is sort of saying, who knows, how you could put into words in a number of ways, none of which are probably accurate, but, I stand at the gates of hell, or I am abandon hope, ye who enter here. I am the master of this nightmarish scene. I am above and beyond all morality. And altogether, that was one of the features of the Nazi regime, and particularly in the SS, the people who saw themselves as the most devoted followers of Adolf Hitler, there was a feeling that all moral constraints have been broken and we can do anything we want because Hitler was believed to be infallible. Nothing that he did was subject to moral sanction. He stood outside history. He stood above and outside all history, all morality. He was a creature of superhuman or even supernatural faculties who changed the course of history. He operated in a norm-free space. So did we, as doers of his bidding. And there was even a term for it, Ostrausch, that is the intoxication of the East. Because you've got east of the borders of Germany and all this German-occupied territory where all the natives were thought to be genetically inferior to Germans who had literal value. You could kill anyone at will, and particularly if you're involved with the murder of the Jewish people, you have transgressed the ultimate norm, which is murder. And that was intoxicating. And the soldier in that scene who's screaming with, obviously not in distress, with a form of glee or excitement, with the body of, stinking murder, burning corpses behind him, that to me, that's, maybe that's the Ostrausch, the intoxication of the East.
They have the feeling of being above morality and not even calling them bodies or corpses. But at the same time, the whole reason why they're doing that is to cover up and if they were covering it up, they had to have, at least somewhere in Nazi leadership, they knew that they were doing something wrong that the rest of the world was not going to like.
Well, I think they knew that the rest of the world was not going to like it. I think they knew that any of them who got captured after the war might be tried for their crimes. So they were destroying evidence in the sense that any murderer destroys evidence. But I don't think that meant that they thought that what they did was wrong. They just knew that other people were not going to share their view of what they were doing.
Right. Yeah. I guess I'm thinking also of the people who are carrying this out. Like they're just doing their job, the SS officers or whoever it may be. And I'm kind of speculating here too, but the idea of, on one hand, they're murdering people and they're not calling them actual people and, bodies or corpses, but they're also covering this up because, well, maybe then what we're doing actually is wrong. And, there had to be that kind of contrast almost there, especially specifically in this part here, because they are covering things up because they know other people don't agree with their ideology, but they seem to be all in on that ideology anyway.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting question. Obviously they have to be aware, and I think they're aware even before they know the war is lost, that there is a dramatic contrast between how they see what they're doing and how the rest of the world sees what they're doing, and indeed probably how their families back home in Germany would see what they're doing. You raise such an important question, and there's so much about their mental state that we can't know. I guess one other thing that I would say that's so valuable in understanding human behavior, not only about this group, but about, I see this in history, I see this in the human beings I've known over the course of my life, and in myself, is the ability of people to sustain contradictions in their minds and to believe multiple things that really don't square logically. because we're not perfectly logical, and people do things for a mixture of motives. And we all have multiple potentialities, and we all have potentiality to do bad. We have potentiality to do good. Our free will with choices we make play a role. Circumstances play a role. The behavior of the people around us do a lot to shape our behavior. I guess one of the things that's so fascinating to me about the Holocaust, why I felt so compelled to study it, is that such extreme situations, how much they reveal about the multiplicity of our potentials and how much they reveal about how malleable we are, how our notions of morality, of what's right and wrong, how quickly these notions can change and how drastically, depending on when the circumstances change compared to what the people around us are doing.
You mentioned the family back home, and that reminds me of something during that part of the movie where we see them, exhuming and burning the bodies. We see what looks like snow falling in Krakow.
Yeah.
But then when Schindler picks it up, of course, the movie is in black and white, but we can see it's not snow, it's ash. And that's when Schindler goes to find the source of the ash. We just talked about that. But the movie doesn't really show any of the other people who are also seeing the same falling ash. Did the citizens of Krakow realize what was going on outside of town?
Well, it really wasn't even outside of town. Plaszow was just a neighborhood of Krakow.
Oh, wow. Okay. I guess I thought it was a little bit a ways from Krakow.
No, as I understand it, for one thing, there's one of the scenes where they're, I guess, after the selection in the camp, they're putting the people who've lost the selection lottery on the train. That's where Schindler says, let's take a fire hose and, water down the cars to give water to them. You can see right in the background the sign of the station. It says Plaszow. It says Krakow-Plaszow. Plaszow is a neighborhood of Krakow. And even if it were a little outside the town, there's no way that the citizens of Krakow were not fully informed about what was going on. They also knew about the clearing of the ghettos. They knew that Germans murdered Jews on sight with no compunction. In Poland, generally, I think there was a pretty good understanding among the Gentile population of what was being done to the Jews.
Again, it's hard for me to put myself in that position of knowing what it was like for people there. But looking back on it, I don't know how anybody would not know what's going on at all.
No, particularly also because the Polish population was treated so brutally by the Germans also. Not quite as bad. There was no German plan to exterminate the Poles. On the other hand, an estimated 1.8 to 1.9 million Poles, that is Christian Poles, died during the German occupation, in addition to the 3 million or so Jewish Poles, Polish Jews who were murdered. A lot from outright murder, a lot from starvation when their food supply was confiscated and shipped back to Germany. Having seen how brutally they were treated and knowing that the Jews were lower down the scale, I don't think it would be at all difficult for them to understand. There's also a scene, if you recall, when the women get diverted by mistake to Auschwitz at the end. As they're on their way into the Auschwitz, you see a Polish child looking at them, and he draws a finger across his throat. He's saying to them, "You're dead. You're going to be killed." And that also has been that's something that's been documented also. In some of the testimony in Shoah, if I remember correctly, there's some Jewish prisoners who talk about seeing, Poles by the side of the tracks.
You mentioned this earlier with when we do see the Jews leaving Plaszow to go to Brunlitz. They leave by two trains. There's one with men and another with women. And the paperwork gets mixed up accidentally, according to the movie, at least, accidentally the women's train is sent to Auschwitz. And then we see that scene where they're forced to take a shower. Makes you think, again, looking back on this, with the knowledge that we have watching a movie now of what happened in the Holocaust, they're being forced to take a shower. We think they're all going to die. Thankfully, it seems to actually be a shower for them. And then Schindler catches the mistake in time and with another bribe gets everything fixed. How much of that actually happened?
That, Dan, I'm a little unsure as to whether that actually happened, but I think it was valuable that they did it just to give an impression of what the experience would have been like for Jews living in Poland brought to the camp. And, earlier in the film, at least an hour earlier, there's a scene where they're in the barracks. I can't remember if it's either the Plaszow barracks or the barracks at the Schindler factory, where one of them says she's heard about the murder process. They take us in, they cut off their hair, then they take our clothes. They tell you you're going to go into a shower and it looks like a shower room. And then they poison them with gas. And a lot of that information, those stories, by that point in time, because we're talking late 1944, would have gotten around to what remained of the Jewish communities in Poland. That scene is so powerful because they're seeing all these steps confirmed. And so they're even more terrified than, say, a group of Jewish prisoners brought in from, say, Holland in 1942 who had no information about the camps. And so that's very powerful. One thing that was that didn't gel about the scene, when they got off the train, they didn't go through a selection. At a real selection on the camps, at the rail siding, the Nazi doctor would have sent all the children and their mothers to the wrong side, to the gas chambers. I mean, according to the testimony of Höss, the Auschwitz commandant, because Auschwitz had about 40 satellite slave labor camps. And the inmates were constantly being worked to death and starved to death. And they were being replenished with a fraction of each train load that came in. And Höss said that out of each train load, typically 25 to 30% were deemed fit to work and sent to replenish the supply at the slave labor camps, the rest going to the gas chambers. This particular train load doesn't go through a selection. But, that's, who knows? That's, unfortunately, that's one point where I'm going to have to say I'm not entirely sure.
The movie focuses mostly on one camp, the Plaszow camp, and then we get to see Auschwitz here. And so even though it does focus mostly on the Plaszow camp, it is good to see that they're showing some other concentration camps, because it wasn't just like we've been talking about throughout. It's not just things happening at this one camp. It was a much larger thing. Overall, do you think the things that we see happening in either in the Plaszow camp or here in this scene in Auschwitz, do you think it does a good job of capturing the essence of what happened across all the camps?
I think the film does a terrific job with the qualification that he doesn't, Spielberg doesn't overwhelm us with the daily horror, the squalor, the living conditions, the starvation, the disease that is so characteristic of all the slave labor camps. And that's just a very intelligent decision because, look, this is not a documentary. The goal, however, is to make it real. And if you overwhelm and numb the audience with too much horror, then you cease to make it real. You fail in your objective. And I feel like he got the balance right.
The entire movie is filled with sad moments, as we've talked about. But there is one scene at the end of the movie that really, it brings it all together. It makes me cry every time I see the movie, no matter how many times I've watched this. It happens after the war in Europe, and you'd think that finally there would be cause for some happiness because they've survived. But Schindler realizes that as a member of the Nazi party, he's a war profiteer, he needs to flee. And then before saying his goodbyes, Schindler starts questioning why he didn't do more. If he sold his car to Goeth, then he could have saved 10 people with that money. He looks at the Nazi party pin. It's made of gold. That's 2 people or maybe 1. But again, that's just 1 more person. And he just breaks down sobbing, almost like this is over. And now he starts to look back on the decisions and the money that he's wasted over the past few years on things that could have saved more lives. Stern there consoles him and reminds him to look around. There's 1,100 people here who are alive because of what he did do. Do we know what Schindler's mindset was like at the end of the war?
From what I remember of reading the Keneally's novel, I don't remember that particular scene. which does not, however, mean that it did not happen. I'm kind of pleading ignorance here. I'm kind of punting a bit on this question. But I think it's also nonetheless valuable because it's a way of reaffirming the value that we need to place, the absolute value we need to place on human life. And the Holocaust, it's the only historical event that frightens us, the only event that people feel a strong desire to deny happened, and that tens of millions of people around the world do, at least to some degree, deny happened. And I think it's because it was the most absolute categorical negation of the intrinsic value of human life. And this is another way to infirm it, to say, because he's kind of saying, if I had ordered a cheaper bottle of champagne at all these dinners I had with these, Nazis, or, if I had spent less money on my mistress, I would have had more cash to buy the freedom of more people. Is it a fair rebuke that Schindler can make to himself? I don't think so. The guy was a hero. But it's in a way it's a good rebuke to all of us, to remind us that the value that we place in human life is something that we can never take for granted, that it's fragile.
That's a great point. I mean, it's a reflection at the end. He's reflecting on everything and the decisions that he made. Almost, it's not his deathbed, but you think of, on your deathbed, you think of, the life flashing before your eyes, and what sort of thing, what decision did I make? What could I have done better in that sort of thing? That's when I was watching this scene, that's kind of the impression that I got, for him, at the end.
I hadn't thought of it that way, but in a way, it's, at the end of our lives, particularly if we don't have firm religious faith, and I personally don't have that. I've often wished that I did, but you kind of have to ask yourself, you want to feel that the world was a better place because you were in it. And so that's the kind of question that a man like Schindler would ask himself at the end of his life. And it's a good one.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on to chat about Schindler's List. Every time I watch this film, we've talked about this, but it reminds me that the events leading up to the Holocaust were gradual. The Nazis didn't start just immediately murdering people in gas chambers. They identified the Jews, enacted different laws for them, segregated, forced them to resettle away from others, and so on. There's a lot more complexity, of course, but something that I think is unique about the Holocaust is it's simultaneously difficult to wrap your head around the reasons why it happened, while also being able to assume that an atrocity on that scale could never happen again. So I thoroughly enjoyed your book called How Could This Happen? Explaining the Holocaust. It does a great job explaining and unraveling some of the historical complexities to get a better understanding of how it happened, but also gives examples of how it's not the only large-scale genocide that has happened. I will, of course, include a link to your book in the show notes for this episode, so anyone listening can get their own copy. But before I let you go, I saved perhaps the biggest question for last. How can we learn from history to avoid this sort of atrocity from happening again?
Well, I would argue that to a very large degree, we've learned a lot. And in the most fortunate countries on earth, that is ours, that is what we would call the first world countries, the world's wealthiest societies, that is our country, and about 36 other countries that are basically our friends and allies. That is to say, the world's other prosperous democracies, because we've learned that it's the value of the democratic form of government. Because democracies don't perpetrate genocide; dictatorships perpetrate genocide. We have learned that racism is bad. We've learned that that there was only one race, but a human race, and we've enacted that into law. For example, in our own country, it took longer than it should have, but the civil rights laws of 64 and 65. We've also come to value, I think, human life far more highly. Yes, there is still war. I mean, there's war of aggression in the heart of Europe, Russia invading Ukraine. Again, Russia's a dictatorship. That's not something that the countries of NATO would never have launched an invasion of Russia or of Ukraine or any other any non-aligned country out of a greed for territory. We know that's wrong. And major warfare is an almost indispensable precondition for genocide. We in the world's, Western societies have by and large avoided major warfare. I feel that the human community has, in fact, all told, made tremendous moral progress since 1945. That said, on the other hand, in the decades that come, I see the possibility for famine, war, and genocide on a scale that could make the Second World War look like a garden party, not because we haven't learned lessons, but because, have so much of what we think of as the third world. The population growth has outrun the carrying capacity of the land. The supply of food and water is already inadequate. You have more and more extreme weather events, drought and hurricane and flooding and so on that are going to negatively impact the supplies of this food and water. You have corrupt and unstable governments, dictatorships rather than democracies. We're going to see wars fought and civil wars fought over resources. So the potential is absolutely horrifying. And there will be plenty of genocide. But on the other hand, I think in a country like ours, for all the ugliness we see in our politics, I don't see how an advanced society like us, like Germany, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Holland, Japan, South Korea, any of the world's countries, democracies that are aligned with us, I don't see that any of us is remotely capable of perpetrating genocide, whereas Germany was in so many respects the most advanced of human societies. So I think we've actually learned how to not do this again. The problem, however, is to what extent can we help the rest of the world also not do it? And unfortunately, because the political systems of all those countries are so badly dysfunctional and kind of beyond our power to fix, our ability to help is going to be limited. And there's a lot, I think about it as little as possible because then it's hard to sleep at night. I guess the final thing I'd say is, progress in human affairs is a case of, often 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Holocaust was 20 steps back. But over time, one thing about human beings is if you look at our history, the desire for progress is inherent in our nature. It's essential to the idea of moral progress is essential to all the world's religious traditions. I look particularly just our country in the last 2.5 centuries for all the ugliness and unfairness and injustice in our society compared to 2.5 centuries ago when our founding fathers owned slaves and thought it was okay. I see massive progress. And so for me, as an historian who's seen the long view of human history, for the long term, I see a very bright future for humanity. And in a way, studying the Holocaust, coming to terms with it, has kind of cemented that optimism because the Holocaust was the strongest argument anyone ever showed me to not be optimistic about human nature and the human future. And what I felt I learned from the book, I think the biggest takeaway that I want people to take is that for this to happen in such an advanced society, it wasn't enough for one thing to go wrong or 2 or 3. It took about a dozen things that had to come together. It was almost an impossible perfect storm. And therefore, having sort of come to terms with what in some ways was the worst thing we've done, my faith in human goodness and in our capacity for moral progress is now kind of rock solid and unassailable. I don't want to be guilty of giving a feel-good interview about the Holocaust. But on the other hand, there's so much pessimism in the world today and in our country. It's so fashionable. And, I think pessimism is intellectually bankrupt. It also doesn't bring out the best in us. And pessimism does not make future genocide less likely. It makes it more likely because it encourages us to give up and not have faith in ourselves.
It's good to be optimistic, but the takeaway there is we can't let our guard down. I mean, because we're always. It took a perfect storm, but not being pessimistic, not giving up.
Thank you. Great minds think alike, Dan.
Thank you again so much for your time, Dan.
Thank you so much for having me, Dan. It's been a pleasure.
This episode of Based on a True Story was produced by me, Dan Lefebvre. I'd like to thank Dan McMillan once again for helping us separate fact from fiction in the movie Schindler's List. If you want to learn even more, I would highly recommend you check out Dan's book called How Could This Happen? Explaining the Holocaust. It's a topic that I've always been interested in. How can humans be so evil to each other? And in his book, Dan does a great job of breaking down the things that led up to the atrocities in the Holocaust happening. You'll find a link to it in the show notes for this episode so you can pick up your own copy. And if you want to learn more about Dan's work, I'll also add a link to his current work as Executive Director of Save Democracy in America to the show notes for this episode as well. So make sure to check that out too. Okay, now it's time for the answer to our 2 truths and a lie game from the beginning of the episode. As a quick refresher, here are the 2 truths and 1 lie. Number 1, the Nazis had a plan to murder all the Jews even before World War II started. Number 2, the citizens of Krakow knew there was a Nazi concentration camp nearby. Number 3, unlike what we see in the movie, Schindler came to Krakow wanting to help Jews. Did you catch which one is a lie? Let's count it down. We'll start with number 3. Unlike what we see in the movie, Schindler came to Krakow wanting to help Jews. That is true. Dan explained that even though the real Oskar Schindler came to Krakow knowing he could help Jews have a better working condition in his factory, the movie does a great job of showing a more typical German business owner, as so many of them took advantage of cheap labor, the slave labor of the Jews. That brings us to number 2. Citizens of Krakow knew there was a Nazi concentration camp nearby. That is also true. As Dan pointed out, most Polish people were treated horribly by the Nazis as well. But they also knew the Jews were treated even worse than the Poles. So with everything that was going on, there was no way the citizens of Krakow were oblivious to what the Nazis were doing. That means number 1 is the lie. The Nazis had a plan to murder all the Jews even before World War II started. We learned that initially the Nazi plan was to eradicate the Jews, to deport them, perhaps to Madagascar or beyond the Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union, basically outside of Nazi-occupied territory. That plan changed, though, as Dan pointed out, most likely in October of 1941, to a plan of murdering all the Jews. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. I really hope you've learned something new. If you got some value out of today's episode, consider giving some value back. You can give back whatever you feel you got out of this episode over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/support to help support the next episode of Based on a True Story. Or you can give back some value simply by sharing this episode with a friend or family member who you think would enjoy it. Until next time, thanks so much for listening, and I'll chat with you again really soon.